Hey Vet Techs, my name is Jesse Roberts. I'm an RVT VTS in anesthesia and analgesia. I'm a part of a team called Veterinary Technician Ambassadors, and today on Elevate we are going to talk about everything intubation. And if you guys had not had a chance to go check out my partner Justin's Down and Dirty EKG, I highly suggest that you guys click on the link and go check out our website at elevatevta.com. Check out his tutorial on Down and Dirty EKG, the basics. It's very informative. I highly suggest you guys go check that out. So today on Elevate, I'm going with everything intubation, so stay tuned. This will be a two-part lecture. In the first part, the endpoints are going to be supplies needed for intubation, the steps during intubation or to intubation. We're going to go over the act of intubation. We're going to go over scenario ideal and not so ideal post-intubation. And then in part two, we're going to be going over confirming intubation. Okay, to start, the supplies needed for a successful intubation are going to be endotracheal tubes, a tie gauze, a lubricant, an appropriate size syringe, an anesthesia assistant, a gauze or some sort of tongue holder, a stylet, and then finally a patient. Now when it comes to endotracheal tubes, we preferably want to get 3 of them, the size you think the patient's going to need, and then let's get one size smaller and one size larger. So if you think your patient's going to have a 10 millimeter endotracheal tube, let's get the 10, let's get the 9.5, and let's get the 10.5. The tie gauze that we are going to be used are to anchor the endotracheal tube in place so it does not move around. Some examples I've seen before used for tie gauze are old IV lines, extension sets, ortho gauze. You guys can get pretty creative with this. Lubricant. We're going to need some sterile lubricant to actually lubricate the actual cuff of the endotracheal tube to allow for a friction-free intubation. We're also going to need some artificial tears to protect the patient's eyes. Now, I know artificial tears technically don't fall under the supplies needed for intubation, but I thought I would add it anyway, because once the patient is under general anesthesia, their tear production is non-existent, so we need to protect the patient's eyes from developing any sort of corneal ulcer or any sort of dry eye. Next, we're going to need a laryngoscope. A laryngoscope comes with a blade and a handle. We want to make sure that that laryngoscope works. There's nothing worse than going to intubate a patient, flipping up your laryngoscope just to realize that the light bulb's out. It makes visualizing the back of the oral pharynx challenging without a functional laryngoscope. We're going to need an appropriate size syringe. The syringe we're going to use is to first pressure check our endotracheal tubes to make sure they're leak-free, and then after intubating, we're going to actually use that same syringe to secure the airway to make sure that there's no leaks. We want to pressure check our endotracheal tubes prior to induction. We're going to do this simply by inflating all 3 of the tubes and then continue on prepping for induction, come back 5 or 10 minutes and make sure that all 3 of those endotracheal tubes are leak-free. If one of them has a leak or it's deflated, simply throw out the endotracheal tube and repeat. We will need a partner. We need an anesthesia assistant or an anesthesia amigo, like I like to say, to help us take the airway and intubate successfully. It is extremely challenging to intubate a patient solo, so I highly suggest that you have an assistant with you when you're planning on to induce a patient. A tongue holder. That's simply a 3x3 or a 4x4 gauze, something for your anesthesia amigo to grasp the tongue and allow them to pull the tongue forward and help you visualize the trachea. The stylet you may or may not need. A stylet is a rigid but malleable introducer which will fit inside the end of the endotracheal tube and allows you to manipulate the tube so you can get into the trachea. And then finally, we're going to need a patient to intubate. So now, going over the steps to intubation. First and foremost, be prepared. Do not rush this step. If you're feeling rushed, take a minute. Take 2 or 3. Let's gather our thoughts, go over our checklist, and make sure you have all your supplies needed. Once you finally feel prepared, then move forward. Preferably, we would like our patient to be in sternal for intubation. It is the easiest way to visualize the trachea while intubating. I do highly suggest that all you techs out there in controlled environments learn how to intubate right lateral, left lateral, and even when the patient is on its back. You guys are going to come across certain situations where your patient becomes extubated unexpectedly, and you're going to need to take that airway back rapidly. And instead of switching the patient from lateral to sternal and running the risk of putting pressure on the abdominal cavity, causing the patient to regurg, it's better if you were able to just intubate the patient the way they are. Next, while you're starting to administer the anesthetics, your anesthesia assistant and you should be communicating about how the patient is starting to relax and become anesthetized. Once that patient has lost its ability to protect their own airway, it's time to take it. So during intubation, we will need communication with yourselves and your anesthesia assistant. The person intubating should be alert, equipped, and that means that they're going to have all their induction supplies ready, their endotracheal tubes lubricated, their endotracheal tubes also pre-measured. What I mean by pre-measure your endotracheal tube is when prior to intubation, you're going to take preferably not the endotracheal tube that you're going to use and pre-measure it to the thoracic inlet or the point of the shoulder. If you have to use the tube or if you're using the tube that you're going to intubate with, wrap it with a piece of paper towel or something, because I always tell people when I'm assisting in intubating that if they're taking that tube and really rubbing it up against their fur, that a flea can get on there, some dirt can get on there, some dander, and then you're going to put that tube in the trachea. So be conscientious about the fact that you're taking that endotracheal tube and rubbing it up against their fur to make sure you pre-measure. So you're going to use the centimeters on the endotracheal tube, the measurement, to know where you're going to stick the endotracheal tube to, so it's down to the thoracic inlet and no further. For intubation, the endotracheal tube should be visualized entering into the patient's oral pharynx, over the epiglottis, through the arytenoids, and down the trachea. Communication with our assistant. The anesthesia assistant should use both hands to help you intubate. One of their hands will be to hold the tongue with the provided 4x4, 3x3, and they're going to extend the tongue out of the mouth, as you can see in this picture. Their other hand should be in a C grip over the dorsal aspect of the maxillary, opening the oral cavity while extending the neck. Now you guys may notice this person in this picture, which is me, I apologize, is not wearing PPE, so make sure you guys do have gloves on while you're assisting. The person intubating should have their dominant hand hold the endotracheal tube and the laryngoscope in the other. So I am left-handed, so I usually hold my laryngoscope with my right hand and my endotracheal tube with my left. I feel more comfortable with my dominant hand having a little bit more dexterity and help aid the endotracheal tube into the trachea. Keep your supplies close by. You may need to get your stylet or the smaller or larger tube once you actually visualize the back of the trachea, the back of the oral pharynx. So now in this clip, the laryngoscope should push down at the base of the epiglottis, and the epiglottis will come down rostrally like a drawbridge. So if this is my epiglottis and this is the tip of my laryngoscope, you're going to push down on the base of the epiglottis and it'll come down like a drawbridge. You don't want to bang it, you don't want to go over it, you can damage the epiglottis and that would cause some trauma. So again, if you can see in the video, you'll see that the base of the laryngoscope is pushing down on the epiglottis at the frenulum. You can see that the epiglottis comes down, and behind that you can visualize the vocal cords, the arytenoids, and then the trachea. And that is exactly where you want to slide your endotracheal tube. You want to slide your endotracheal tube just parallel to the laryngoscope blade down the trachea to the thoracic inlet where you pre-measured to. The next step involves communication and awareness of the patient in front of you. So we've intubated. Our patient is pink. Ask your anesthesia assistant to manually hold the endotracheal tube while you secure the endotracheal tube in place with the provided tie gauze. You're going to secure the tube above the snout, below the mandible, behind the ears. After securing the endotracheal tube, ask for a life check. This can simply be accomplished by your assistant feeling for a pulse on any nearby artery, the femoral, the ulnar, the carotid. They can even put their hand over the chest just to make sure that the patient is still having a heartbeat. Next, we were going to fill our endotracheal tube with our syringe while listening for a leak. And what I mean by fill the endotracheal tube is we want to provide a leak-proof airway. So there is no chance of regurging getting past the cuff and down into the lungs, causing aspiration pneumonia, and as well as not having any sort of inhalant come around the cuff on the way out and exposing all the personnel to the noxious gas. So this is simply accomplished by connecting your syringe to the one-way valve that is located at the end of the pilot line on the endotracheal tube. Your anesthesia assistant should communicate breath or breathing every time they apply pressure to the rebreathing bag while you are actually listening for the leak. You're going to put your ear down towards the snout to the patient and listening for sounds coming around the endotracheal tube. When a pressure of 20 centimeters of H2O has been reached, the anesthesia assistant should communicate that 20 centimeters of H2O has been reached, as well as holding or not holding. Do not fill the endotracheal tube if you do not hear a leak. Any sort of overinflating the endotracheal tube can cause ischemic damage to the tracheal mucosa. If initially you do not hear a leak, in about 5 to 10 minutes after intubation, the muscles around the neck area may have relaxed and then you will have a leak. So in about 5 or 10 minutes post-intubating, check again. Hold your pop-off closed, squeeze your rebreathing bag, and make sure it's holding at 20 centimeters of H2O. If you've closed the pop-off while pressing your endotracheal tube, do not forget to open that pop-off valve. Next, we're going to lube the eyes and start our anesthetic patient assessments. Then and only then should you consider about turning on your inhalant. Now, to go over not such an ideal post-intubation scenario. So you've intubated, and perhaps your patient is not pink. Perhaps they're a little bit cyanotic. You pushed a little bit too much propofol. You're going to ask your anesthesia assistant to manually secure the tube while we connect the circuit and provide oxygen and ventilation until our patient is pink again. Again, ask for a life check while you're providing O2 and ventilation. Once perfusion looks adequate, continue with the intubation process. We will then secure the tube, pressure check until our circuit holds to 20 centimeters of H2O. We will lube the eyes and then assess. So, to recap what we went over. We talked about the supplies needed to set up your intubation for success. We went through the steps to intubation. We went over the act of intubation. We went over steps how to essentially take the airway. We went over a scenario that was an ideal post situation after intubation and then not so ideal intubation. Inducing a patient is a necessary step in our profession. Prepare yourself for success, take your time, and do not be afraid to ask for help. I hope everyone has learned something today to make you more of a professional that you guys already are. Next up on Elevate, we'll be confirming intubation in part 2. I will share a variety of ways to confidently confirm that we have intubated successfully. Take care, vet techs.